session, we're going to take a look at how language use changes depending upon a person or a language user's social class. So this means we're going to be exploring a concept called a sociolect. And a sociolect is a dialect of a language or variation of a language that is very directly associated with a specific social class. In order to look at language and social class, we first have to understand what a social class is. So we're going to define the term social class. Then we'll take a look at what happens when language and social class interact. So how do these two concepts or ideas mutually influence each other? We'll compare and contrast regional variation with social class variation when it comes to language use. So how are these the same? How are they different? We'll also take a look at how researchers research social class language variation. So how do we determine what that language variation based on social class actually is? And finally, we'll look at language use and social class concepts. So let's get started digging into language and social class. As always, we need to start by defining some terms, and actually one term in particular, the term social class. Social class means a layer of a society that is characterized by a specific amount of wealth, prestige, and power. So every society is divided into social classes. Where societies vary, however, is first of all in the number of social classes and also in the distinct or the degree of difference among the different social classes. But every society does stratify groups of people according to wealth, prestige, and power. So this is social class. There is one other aspect to social class that's important, and that is social class also defines an individual's or a group's standard of living and also life prospects. So the idea is, or the concept is that the higher a person's social class, the higher his or her standard of living, and also the higher his or her overall life prospects. And a standard of living, or a social class, is measured both objectively and subjectively. The objective measure of social class is economic. So, income, any dollar figure that indicates very objectively, here's where someone fits. But then the subjective ones are actually the more powerful ones, and this is where things like prestige and status and power and perception come into play. So we do have this objective measure of social class and then a subjective measure of social class. But it all relates to an individual or group's standard of living and overall life prospects. Now that we know what social class is, we need to look at how do we actually determine what the social classes are in a society and which social class an individual belongs to. You might think this is really simple. You might think that we just strictly use an objective measure. So people with the highest income are in the highest social classes and people with the lowest income are in the lowest social classes. But that's actually not the case, because remember, we've got this subjective element in there as well, which kind of throws it off. So someone may not have a lot of income, but for some other subjective reasons, power or prestige, that person is in a higher social class. You might also think, okay, we can just make social classes depending on profession or occupation. So we might have the professions at the very top, so your doctors and lawyers and judges and all of that stuff. And then we might have managers, and then skilled workers and semi-skilled workers and unskilled workers. Once again, this sounds pretty logical, but that doesn't always match how income goes. So your occupation doesn't always reflect your income. So that one's problematic. Then we get into situations in some societies or cultures where family name actually is the root of your social class. So if you belong to a specific family, that puts you at a certain level or a certain social class in a society. So a lot of different things contribute to each specific society's social classes or each culture's social classes. So it is a combination of that objective measure of economics and income versus subjective things like power, prestige, the occupations come into there, and a lot of other factors come into determining social class. And it does vary by society. So if you want to have a quick think about this and apply this, take a look at the society in which you are in and see if you can figure out first of all, what the social classes are in that society, and then how those social classes are determined. And as I said, every society does this slightly differently. So you may be surprised when you start to look at your own society about how that society determines social class. The next thing we need to look at is how we actually judge someone's social class or decide or perceive which social class someone belongs to. So being human beings, we see another person, we've never met them before, and we make a very quick first impression of that person. And one of the things we do is we kind of sort them out in terms of which social class we think they belong to. Every human being does this. It's just what we do to try and organize our experiences. So how do we make this quick first impression about someone's social class? Well, we do it a number of ways. First of all, we look at what kinds of clothes are they wearing. So are their clothes neat and tidy and clean? Do they have the most fashionable trends or the most expensive brands? So clothing, jewelry choice, these things are a very strong indicator of social class. We also look at how they behave. Okay, so how confidently does a person hold himself or herself? What's the person's posture like? How does he or she walk? So these types of behaviors help us make judgments about social class as well. We also look at language use. So we listen to how a person speaks, what type of pronunciation they have, what type of sociolect they use, which we'll get into. So language use really is an indicator that we use to judge someone's social class. We also look at other things. We look at what type of car they're driving, what type of house they have, where their house is located. If we can, we find out what level of education they have. And these things all help us make this really quick judgment about which social class someone belongs to. This system of this first impression that we make as human beings about someone's social class, it's not always right. And we can really have some fun playing with people if we want to by positioning ourselves as perhaps belonging to one social class when in fact we belong to a different social class. So we could, for example, if I'm very, very wealthy, but I don't wear the latest brands, and maybe my clothes are clean, but they're not, the most expensive clothing out there. So I can be deliberately dressing so that people think I'm below the social class that I am actually in. And we can do the reverse, okay? I might not have a lot of money, but the money I have, I spend on clothes so that I can project this image of belonging to a different social class other than the one to which I really do belong. So first impressions are very useful because they help us categorize people when we meet them for the first time, but you always have to bear in mind that each individual makes choices about how much he or she projects the social class to which he or she actually belongs. So some people may be deliberately trying to mislead you with the first impression that they create, either trying to say, okay, I'm in a higher social class than I am, or I'm in a lower social class than I am. So we can actually have a lot of fun with the first impressions that we make on people when it comes to social class. What does social class have to do with language use? Research shows that there's a really, really close connection between our social class and the language choices that we make when we use a language. So that means that people of a specific social class actually develop a variation of their language that indicates that they belong to that social class. This is called a sociolect. So a sociolect is a distinct variation of a language that is used by people who want to project that they belong to a specific social class. There's also another really interesting connection between social class and language use, and that this happens in societies that are multilingual. So in some societies where multiple languages are spoken, what happens is that members of a specific social class may choose to speak one language, and members of another social class will choose to speak a different language. So your actual language choice reflects whichever social class you belong to. Here are a couple of examples of this at work. French used to be the language of the aristocracy all over Europe. And so if you spoke French very fluently, and if you chose to use French, that was an indication that you belonged to the aristocracy. And it didn't matter which country you were in. Okay? You could be in England, you could be in France, you could be wherever, but your use of French indicated that you belonged to the aristocracy. Here's another example from today. If we look at India, The use of English in India is actually very closely related to social class. So individuals in the higher social classes in India are tend to be, not always, but they tend to be more fluent in English because they've had their education completely in English, and they speak an English that is very close to the Queen's English, so received pronunciation. So, whereas when you start to go down to the lower social classes, the fluency or proficiency in English is less, and also the dialect of English that is used is quite different from the dialect that's used in the higher social classes. So India is an example of specific language use choices that reflect social class. Just as a quick recap, a sociolect is a specific variation of a language that is used by members of a specific social class. So a sociolect identifies members of that social class. This concept of sociolect is really important when we're looking at certain cultures, and maybe not so important in other cultures. So we can categorize cultures in many different ways, but one of the ways that we can distinguish one culture from another is in terms of how stratified it is. So if a culture is very stratified or very hierarchical, it has a lot of difference between people in the very high classes and people in the lower classes. If a society is flatter, then there's less of a difference in terms of power and prestige and everything between people in the higher social classes and people in the lower social classes. This is a really important concept to remember because when it comes to sociolects, cultures that are very hierarchical and they've got a lot of distance between people in the higher social classes and the lower social classes, that's where we really see the power that goes with different sociolects. So people at the very top of a society or that culture will have a very distinct sociolect because they want to be differentiated from the people below them. In a flatter society, sociolects still exist, but there's not a huge amount of difference among the different sociolects. So it's not really, really clear that someone's either in the highest social class or the lowest social class. So this is really important when it comes to sociolects. In some societies, you'll see very, very distinct and very prestigious sociolects. In other societies that tend to be flatter, less hierarchical, your sociolects won't be as distinct, and there will actually be fewer of them, and the prestige difference among the sociolects is almost irrelevant. There's another feature of different cultural groups that also is closely tied to sociolects, and this is how each cultural group gives an individual status. So we have this concept called ascribed status. And this means that an individual gets status because of his or her family or some other quality or characteristics that that person really isn't responsible for. They just kind of lucked into it or didn't have any luck, depending on your perspective. And then at the opposite end of this, we have what's called achieved status. And this means that I have prestige and I have power because I've earned it. Okay? I've worked hard, I've educated myself, I've taken advantage of opportunities that have been presented to me, and so on. And what we see with these different ways of giving an individual status and sociolect is that in societies or cultures where there is ascribed status, we tend to see, once again, more distinct sociolects and sociolects with a lot more prestige associated with them. In societies or cultures where that are based on achieved status, we tend to see fewer sociolects and they're less distinct sociolects. So this is another really important characteristic of a culture or society that links with sociolects. The UK is a really good example of sociolects in action. So let's take a little bit of a deeper look at what goes on in the UK in terms of sociolects. So a lot of people don't want to admit this, but the UK is actually a very hierarchical society, and it's starting to flatten out a little bit, but it's still quite hierarchical. And it is also a society or a culture with a lot of ascribed status. So your social status really comes from the family that you're born into, as opposed to what you achieve. Once again, this is changing, but it's still a fairly distinct feature of the UK. So in the UK, we have a lot of sociolects and a lot of social classes and corresponding sociolects. And those sociolects have quite distinct degrees of prestige and status associated with them. So at the very high end, the sociolect that has the most prestige and the most status is RP, or received pronunciation. Another way to describe this one is it's the Queen's English. So this is the dialect of English that people at the very top of British society speak. And then going down, we've got a whole series of other sociolects, each with decreasing amounts of prestige and status. And the UK is a really interesting example because not only does it have a lot of sociolects, and not only does it have distinct prestige and power among the sociolects, but you really see the effect of this on people's lives. So even today, a lot of hiring decisions are made based on how someone speaks because their particular sociolect places them at a specific level of UK society. So hiring decisions are very often made on how someone speaks. And so there are people who learn to speak differently in order to get hired into positions that they otherwise would not get hired into. And in terms of relationships, marriages, things like that, sociolects also come into play. Nobody wants to admit it, but it's still there, quite interestingly. So, marrying from one social class to a higher or lower one is not as common, or it's not as easy to do as it might be in other cultures. It is getting easier and more common, but you still see relationship decisions also being made based on sociolect and social class. So social class and sociolect are really interesting to look at in the UK. There's a great story about sociolect and social class in the UK, and that's the story of My Fair Lady, based on George Bernard Shaw's play Pygmalion. So if you get the chance, have a look at this movie. It's been turned into a musical, and it's a great show. It's a great storyline, and it's about a woman from a lower social class who speaks a very low prestige sociolect being trained to speak a different sociolect so that she can be perceived as coming from a higher social class. So this is a great example of sociolects at work and someone very deliberately learning a different sociolect in order to be perceived as belonging to a higher level social class. So if you have time, I really recommend that you take a look at this movie, My Fair Lady. Another example that I've already mentioned about the really clear connection between social class and language use is India. So India has a very stratified society, so it's very hierarchical, and there are very distinct layers to the society. And the layer or the class that you're born into is the one that you stay in for life. And your family name very often indicates whichever layer of society you've been born into. And there's social mobility up and down this class system is very, very difficult. So India is another example of a very hierarchical society with very clear social classes and very clear language use choices that go with those social classes. And so I mentioned that the English language use is one of the indicators of social class in India, and then also dialects are an indicator, and different language choices. So speaking one language versus another is also an indicator of social class in India. So if you have some time, that's another really interesting society to look at to really explore this connection between social class and language use. Canada is another example that we can look at for social class language variation, but it's a bit of a different one because Canada is a much flatter society, so we are not considered to be a hierarchical society. We only have three main social classes, upper, middle, and lower. We don't have multiple levels in our society. And we also don't have distinct sociolects. You can't really hear someone speak and say, okay, you're upper class or you're middle class or you're lower class. There are some variations, but they're not really drastic the way that you would find in other societies such as the UK. So Canada is an example of a flatter society with sociolects that are not very distinct at all. So it's in a bit of a contrast to the other two societies we've looked at. Language variation gets really interesting when we look at social class variation, so sociolects, alongside of regional variation. So language differences depending upon the geographical area that the users live in. And sometimes it's very difficult to see which one is the more powerful variation at work. Is it social class variation or regional variation? So researchers have looked at this issue to try and uncover some of the dynamics that are going on. And the dynamics vary from one society to another. Let's start by taking a look at the UK. In the UK, researchers have found that regardless of where the person lives, if they're in the higher social classes, they will have the same language variation. So for the upper classes in the UK, sociolect is the driving force with their language choice or their language use. However, when it comes to the lower classes in the UK, that's where regional variation kicks in. So lower class groups in different areas of the UK will actually speak different language variations. So at the upper classes, it's all about sociolect, but at the lower classes, regional variation is the more powerful force. India is a contrast to that. In India, at both levels of a society, at all levels of society, so the upper classes and the lower classes, it's all about sociolect. So the higher classes speak a specific, very distinct sociolect, and the lower classes speak a very distinct sociolect. So India is a little bit different in that it's all about sociolect. There's very little regional variation going on amongst the different social classes. So two very interesting examples of the social class language choices at work and the regional language choices at work. Research on language use in social class is quite interesting to look at. Some of the earliest research on this issue was done by Labov in the 1960s. And this was a really interesting set of research. So what this researcher did was to look at the language that sales staff in 3 different department stores chose to use with customers. And the assumption was that the sales staff would adjust their language use to the language use of the customers to make the customers feel at home. And through this, the researchers thought that they would be able to identify the sociolects that were at work. And this actually did work. So they chose 3 department stores, and each department store was determined to be catering to a different social class. And then the sales staff adjusted their speaking according to the type of clients that they had coming in. And so they were able to identify very clear sociolects through this type of research. Another set of research done on language and social class was done by Trudgill in the 1960s and 1970s. And this research was very similar to the research that went before it. In this case, the researchers identified 5 social classes. And they did this, first of all, by creating a social index, and then by having participants self-identify as being part of a particular social class. And then they made the assumption that these participants would try to get their speaking to most closely associate with the prestige dialect or the prestige variation of the language, the higher they were in terms of social class. And this did actually happen. And through this, they were able to distinguish 5 different social classes, looking at 1 or 2 very distinct language features of the different sociolects. Both Labov's and Trudgill's research showed us something else that's very interesting when it comes to language use and social class, and that is that speakers can actually very strategically choose to use one sociolect versus another sociolect. Hence, we get the salespeople in the department stores adjusting their language use depending upon the customers that are coming in and how those customers speak. So sociolect is not as, it's much more fluid than we might think. And people can be very conscious about which sociolect they're using. And we can also very strategically choose, okay, I'm going to use this sociolect versus this sociolect. So the research was really interesting because it did uncover very conscious strategies that people were using in order to associate themselves with a particular social class. So this is something that's really interesting about sociolects. We can strategically choose to use one sociolect or another depending upon how we want to be perceived. Current research on sociolects really does focus on this last area. It focuses on individual choices that we make in very specific situations depending upon how we want to be perceived. So we may make a very clear choice to use a sociolect that says, okay, we're part of this group. Or we may make an equally clear choice to use a sociolect that says we're not a part of this social group or this social class. So that's where research is at right now when it comes to social class, sociolects, and language use, really looking at the individual choices that people make with respect to their sociolects. There's another interesting research technique that has been used when it comes to sociolects, social class, and language use, and that is matched guise testing. Matched guise testing is a very specific type of research in which they will have participants rate a speaker on his or her social class, wealth, and intelligence, and a variety of other factors based only upon hearing this person speak. And so what they find is that they can take the same person, it's exactly the same individual, but if that individual changes the way he or she speaks, then the participants in the study rate his or her wealth and social class and intelligence very differently. So matched guise testing really helps us to understand that so much of our language use results in different perceptions, and we can make individual choices depending on how we want to be perceived. We can take the same person and have that person speak differently and then be perceived differently based on that language use. There are a few other concepts that we can explore when we're looking at language use and social class. So the first of these concepts is style. Style is our choice of language on a scale of formal to informal based upon a situation that we find ourselves in or how we want to be perceived. So formal language very closely approximates the standard of the language. So formal language is perceived as being the standard. Then informal language involves choices we make in terms of our pronunciation, our vocabulary, and our grammar to indicate that we are speaking in a much more informal situation, and the relationships are less about power and more about equality. So style is all about this choice we make from formal to informal. Style is very closely related to sociolects and social class and language use choices because the higher class sociolects tend to be more formal. So they tend to be closer to the standard and they tend to be used in very formal situations. The lower class sociolects tend to use more informal patterns of language use in terms of pronunciation, vocabulary, and grammar. So that's the connection between style and social class. So the more formal styles connect fairly closely with higher level sociolects or higher class sociolects, and the informal styles connect with the lower class sociolects. Another concept that's really important when it comes to social class and language use is the concept of register. When a group of people regularly communicates together about the same topic, all of the users all of the language users in that situation kind of develop a secret code. They develop communication shortcuts so that their communication and language use can be as efficient as possible. This is called register. So register depends upon the topic that you're talking about, who you're talking to, where you're talking, and why you're talking. So these four things help us create different registers depending on the situations we're in. So researchers have identified 5 main categories of register. So let's take a look at these. The first category or layer of register is called static register. And static register is a set of language use that never changes or changes just a very, very tiny amount. So static register is almost frozen in time. And it's really interesting because static register gives us a bit of a look back at the old form of the language. So where the language we currently use came from years and years ago, often hundreds of years ago. So some examples of static register are the Lord's Prayer. So that has not changed in its purest form for many, many years. Constitutional documents are examples of static register. Legal documents are examples of static register. So any set of language that really hasn't changed over time is static register. And it tends to be very formal, so it has a very formal style. So that's the first layer of register. The second layer of register is called formal register. And just as the name says, it is a very formal style of communication. And it's a one-way form of communication. So it's not a dialogue or a conversation. It is communication that is just from me to you or to a greater audience. So formal register is found in things like speeches and lectures and pronouncements where the focus is really on that single speaker. And as the name implies, the language use in formal register is very formal. The next layer of register is called consultative register. And this is a style of communication or a form of communication in which there are two or more people, but one of those people is kind of the knower. So this person has more knowledge or more expertise than the other person or the other people. And the knower is giving information or providing advice to the other people. So examples in which we would see a consultative register at work include a consultation between a doctor and a patient and a lawyer and a client, for example. So it's very much about there's a knower and someone who needs to know, and that's the flow of communication. And like formal register, consultative register is quite formal. The fourth layer of register is called casual register. And as this implies, it's a very informal style of communication, and it's used amongst very close friends and peers and people who are basically socially equal. So in casual register, there are lots of inside jokes. Vocabulary has been changed, so only the people who are part of this group know that particular vocabulary. There might be specific phrases that people like to use. Anything that indicates, okay, we're close friends and we're part of this nice, secret, very secure group of people and we trust each other. So that's the casual register. The fifth and final layer of register or category of register is called the intimate register. As the name implies, this is a style of language use that we use with people with whom we're very close. So family members, boyfriends, girlfriends, spouses, and so on. And the intimate register, is characterized by a lot of emotional communication. So that emotion is communicated via intonation, with pet phrases and nicknames and things like that. And nonverbal communication is also very important in this register because we do communicate a lot of emotion non-verbally. So that's the final layer of register called the intimate register. How is register associated with social class and language use? This one's really interesting. What researchers have found is that the more formal registers, so for example, the formal register, the consultative register, those tend to be more the standard with the higher social classes. So they more closely equate with the higher social class sociolects. And then with the lower class sociolects, there's more of a correspondence with the other layers of register, so the casual register and the intimate register. It also gets really interesting because depending upon the social class that a language user belongs to, he or she may think that the communication belongs at a particular register, but it actually doesn't. So determining which piece of language or language use patterns belong to a register actually varies according to social class as well. So it kind of muddies the picture a little bit, but it makes it very interesting. So register has a bit of a complicated relationship with social class and sociolect, but it's a very important relationship. The next concept we need to take a look at when it comes to social class and language use is the concept of politeness. So politeness is all about language choices that we make when we're speaking with someone to make him or her feel comfortable. So we don't want the person we're speaking to feel awkward or embarrassed or uncomfortable, so we use politeness in order to make that person feel the opposite, feel comfortable. And politeness is all about not imposing on someone and not directly asking him or her for something. So politeness involves a lot of phrases like, I'm really sorry to bother you, but, or I hate to bother you, but can I ask you a question? I know I'm imposing on you, but could I trouble you too? So there's these very lengthy phrases that we use so as not to push on or push our needs onto someone or to trouble them or to make them feel uncomfortable. So this is what politeness is all about. Another term that comes into play when we're talking about politeness is the term face-threatening act, and we abbreviate this to FTA. A face-threatening act is something that a person does or says that makes the other person feel uncomfortable, feel embarrassed, or feel threatened. And the whole idea of a face-threatening act is that we use it when we're trying to not be polite. So politeness is the opposite. Politeness is all about not using face-threatening acts when we're communicating with someone so that they do feel comfortable. So with politeness, we want to avoid face-threatening acts. In other situations, when we don't want to be polite, when we don't care whether we make someone feel uncomfortable or not, we will actually very deliberately use face-threatening acts. But politeness is all about not using face-threatening acts. There are two types of politeness. The first type of politeness is called positive politeness, and the other one, very surprisingly or not surprisingly, is called negative politeness. Positive politeness is a strategy I use when I want to communicate to you, I respect you, and I want you to respect me. So I'm very complimentary, but very professional. I don't overdo things. I'm not overly flattering or anything, but I'm just giving this very clear message. I respect you, and I want you to respect me. The opposite of this is negative politeness. When I use negative politeness as a strategy, I actually want something from you. With positive politeness, I don't want anything from you. I'm just saying, I respect you, and I want you to respect me. With negative politeness, I want something from you, so I'm going to be slightly ingratiating and sort of put you a little bit above me because you have something that I want. So that's what negative politeness is versus positive politeness. Negative politeness is actually quite interesting from a language use perspective. So there's different techniques of language use that we use when we're using negative politeness as a strategy. And this language use gives the message, I know I'm imposing on you, but I need something from you. So the first language use strategy is hedging. So I might do something, I might say something like this, could you open the window for me, please? So I'm hesitating and I'm not showing any degree of confidence when I'm asking you to do something for me. Another strategy or language use strategy for negative politeness is pessimism. So I'm sort of putting it in a negative framework right from the get-go. So I might say something like, well, I don't suppose you could open the window for me. So I'm being a little bit negative with my language choice. So that's pessimism. Another language use strategy for negative politeness is indicating deference. So I'm putting someone above me in terms of power in this situation. So I might say, to get the window open, I might say, excuse me, sir, would you mind opening the window? So, or would you mind if I open the window? So I'm putting the person I'm speaking to higher. So that's indicating deference. Another negative politeness strategy for language use is apologizing. I'm really sorry, but could you open the window? So I apologize that I'm imposing on you, but I still need the window opening. And then finally, another language use strategy for negative politeness is impersonalization. So I take myself right out of the picture and very formally say, the management requires that the window be open. So I'm taking myself out of the picture, but I'm still getting done what I want done. So these are all different, really interesting language use strategies for negative politeness. Two researchers, Brown and Levinson, came up with another way to look at politeness. They came up with 4 politeness strategies. So these are a bald on-record strategy, a positive politeness strategy, a negative politeness strategy, and an off-record indirect politeness strategy. So let's take a look at each of these 4 strategies in turn. The first of Brown and Levinson's politeness strategies really is not polite at all. This is the bald on-record strategy. And with this strategy, I don't care if I commit any face-threatening acts. I don't care if you're uncomfortable. I don't care if I embarrass you. So I'm really not at all concerned for the person receiving the message. So there's 4 situations in which this strategy is usually used. The first is in an urgent situation. So if the building is burning, I'm not going to come up to you and say, I'm really sorry to impose upon you, but would you mind exiting the building? I'm just going to yell, get out of the building. Okay? So in an urgent situation, we use this strategy. Another situation in which we use this strategy is when we're in a very task-oriented situation. So I've got deadlines, I need to get things done, I've got the power to kind of order you around. So I'll just say, give me the phone, get this done, do this, do that. Another situation in which we use this strategy is when we want to put forward a very strong request. So for example, if I'm the teacher and you're the student, and you're sitting in class talking on your cell phone or texting or whatever, I might say very clearly and very directly, put your cell phone away. The final situation in which we use this strategy is when I need to give you a warning. So for example, if you're standing daydreaming in the middle of the street and a car is coming towards you, I'm not once again going to say, I'm sorry to impose upon you, would you mind moving because the car's going to hit you. I'm just going to yell, "Get out of the way." So a warning is another situation in which we use this strategy. And it's a strategy that really isn't polite at all because it's very direct, very to the point. Here's what you need to do. The second strategy from Brown and Levinson is the positive politeness strategy. In this strategy, I'm assuming that I'm equal to you if it's you that I'm talking to. So I'm equal, we've got this two-way friendly relationship, and it's quite professional and very respectful, and we both want to maintain this relationship. So there are different strategies that we can use in order to maintain or use positive politeness. The first one is called attend to the hearer. So I'm very aware of what you need. So for example, I might say to you, "Oh, you must be hungry, let me get you a sandwich." So I'm very aware of how you're feeling or what you've been through. Another strategy I might use here, a language use strategy, is I might avoid disagreement. So I'm not going to directly say, "Okay, I disagree with you," or something, but I'll sort of avoid it. So for example, if you ask me, "Well, how does this dress look on me?" I might say, "Oh, it sort of looks okay on you." So I'm not directly saying, "Hey, it doesn't look okay," but I'm not saying enthusiastically, "Yes, it looks really good on you." Another strategy is that I'm going to assume agreement. So I'm not even going to ask you, "Do you agree?" I'm going to assume it. So instead of saying, "Do you agree that we should leave at 3 o'clock?" I'm just going to say, "So let's leave at 3 o'clock." So I'm just going to assume that you're in agreement with me here. I forgot one other language use strategy that goes with the overall strategy of positive politeness, and this is hedging an opinion. So rather than saying very directly what my opinion is, I sort of use other words to hedge it or hide my opinion. So instead of saying, "Look, you need to study harder," okay, I'm just giving you flat out, "Look, you're not studying hard enough." I might say, "Well, you really should think about studying harder." So I've kind of buried my opinion by these other words, and so I'm diluting the strength of my opinion a little bit. Not, "You need to study harder, get your act together," but "You really should think about studying harder." So I've kind of softened my opinion there. So that's another strategy for language use that goes with positive politeness. Brown and Levinson's next strategy is a negative politeness strategy. And this is very similar to the negative politeness definition that we've already looked at. So with a negative politeness strategy, the speaker knows he or she is imposing on the other person, and that the other person has a little bit of power over him or her because of that. And so through the language use choices, the speaker acknowledges, there's a bit of an imposition going on here. Here are some language use strategies that go with Brown and Levinson's negative politeness strategy. So the first one is to be indirect. So let's say I don't have enough money and I need to borrow some money from you. So instead of directly saying, "Look, can I borrow some money from you?" I'm going to say, "I'm really stressed out about money right now." So I'm sort of indirectly hinting, "You know what, I could really use a loan right now." Another language use strategy for negative politeness is to apologize. So instead of directly saying, "Can I borrow $10 from you?" I'm going to put an apology in front of it. I'm really, really sorry, but I have to ask you if I can borrow $10 from you. So I apologize first. Another strategy is to minimize the imposition. And we do this using the word just. "I just want to take a few minutes of your time to ask if I could borrow your car." So we minimize the imposition by putting the word just in there. "I just need a few minutes, I just need a few dollars, I just need a little bit of your time." A final language use strategy that goes with negative politeness is pluralizing the responsibility. So let's say you and I work at the same office and we both get home, and then I realize I forgot or you forgot to lock the office door, and one of us needs to go back and lock that door. So rather than phoning you up and saying, "You know what, you need to go back and lock the door because I don't want to do it," I'm going to phone you up and say, "You know what, we forgot to lock the office door when we left this afternoon." Then I'm hoping that you're going to pick up on, "I want you to go and lock the office door because I don't want to do it." So we pluralize responsibility so that the other person we're talking to feels included in this sphere of responsibility, and then that person will then volunteer and say, "Okay, I'll do it." So it's another very indirect strategy, and it falls under negative politeness. Brown and Levinson's final strategy for politeness is an off-record indirect strategy. So this is a complete avoidance of any face-threatening act. So it is very, very indirect. So we've got some language use strategies that go along with this. The first of these is that instead of directly saying something, I'm going to give you a hint. So I'm really cold and I want you to close the window this time. So instead of saying, can you please close the window, or just close the window, I might say, oh, it's really cold in here. And then I expect you to pick up on the hint and get up and close the window. Another off-record indirect strategy is to be vague. So instead of saying, you know what, you need to be more responsible with your phone because you've just come and told me you've lost your cell phone again, I might make the vague general statement, you know, people should be more careful with their phones. And once again, you should take the hint that you personally need to be more careful with your phone. A final language use strategy is to be sarcastic or joking. So let's say you're dating someone and I really don't think much of this person. And so instead of saying, you know what, you probably could find someone better to date, or I don't like this person, I might say in a joking way or a sarcastic way, wow, he's a real winner, isn't he? Or she's a real winner, isn't she? And so I'm not directly saying, look, I don't think much of this person. I'm putting a sarcastic or joking twist on it. So it's once again very, very indirect. Now that we've looked at different definitions of politeness and negative and positive politeness and Brown and Levinson's 4 strategies for politeness, we need to answer the question, what's the relationship between politeness and language and social class? And the answer is a very simple one. As people move up in higher socioeconomic class, so the higher classes, for example, people get more polite with their language use. So they're very less direct usually, and they use a lot more very strategic politeness strategies with their communication. So it's not always true, but generally in most situations when you go higher in social class, the standard language that people in that social class does actually become more polite and more formal, as we've already seen. In this look at the relationship between language use and social class, we've looked at a lot of different concepts. So we started off by defining what social class is, and then we defined and looked at this concept called a sociolect, which is language variation that we see based upon social class. And we see this within one specific language group or another specific language group. We get variation within that language based on social class. So this is a sociolect. We've also looked at a few other concepts. We've looked at this concept of style, the concept of register, and the concept of politeness, and then how each of these relate to this language use and social class relationship. The final point to discuss here before we conclude this session is how all of this relates to language teaching and language learning. Well, the answer is that we need to make our students aware of any language variation that does exist in the language they're learning when it comes to language use and social class. So as our students get higher in their language proficiency level, we actually need to introduce them to concepts such as sociolects. We definitely need to introduce them to style and register and politeness. So then our students can become aware of how the language they're learning varies depending upon social class. Then our students can very strategically learn the different sociolects that do go along with the language they're learning. So language use in social class is a really, really interesting area both for research and also for language teachers because it opens up a lot of language variation that we want to make our students aware of.